some ice cream while you're here.
Good evening. Hi, my name is Emily Underwood. I work in community engagement at the Missouri Historical Society. And on behalf of MHS, I want to thank you for joining us virtually this evening for our installment of STL History Live, Stories from Home, from Communist Hungary to St. Louis with Barna Sabo. This program is presented with Bilingual International Assistance Services and the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum in recognition of the UN International Day in Support of Victims of Torture, which is this Saturday, June 26th. Before we get started, I do have a few things to mention. Safety is, of course, always a top priority for us. So while we are starting to transition a little bit back to in-person programming, most of our programs do remain virtual through the summer. Both the History Museum in Forest Park and Soldiers Memorial Military Museum downtown are open to the public Wednesday through Sunday. We would love for you to visit if that's something you feel comfortable doing. You can make advanced reservations at mohistory.org to plan your visit and get your free tickets. I want to thank all of our Missouri Historical Society members for your support. We're so grateful for your contributions that help us do these programs and exhibits and keep history alive. And if you aren't a member yet, we would love for you to consider joining and supporting the mission today. And you can do that by visiting our website at mohistory.org/support. And I also want to thank everyone in the St. Louis City and County area for your tax contributions through the Zoo Museum Tax District. The STL History Live virtual programming series mostly takes place on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. and Thursdays at 6:30 p.m. We also have monthly Soldiers Memorial Chow and Chat programs. Those are always on a Wednesday at noon. And you can find the entire lineup of programs at our website, which is mohistory.org. There's an events calendar there, or you can look at the Missouri History Museum Facebook page and see our event listings there. Also, most of our programs do get recorded and posted to the Missouri Historical Society YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and rewatch the program or share it with friends and family, you can go back and find this program there later. And finally, when you close out of the program today, you'll notice that a tab should have opened in your browser. It should have a very brief survey in there for you. And we always value your feedback. So we really hope that you'll take just a minute or two to fill that out. Let us know what you thought about the program today. And we appreciate that in advance. Thank you. So as I mentioned earlier, this program is presented with Bilingual International Assistance Services and the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. I want to thank both of the organizations, and I especially want to thank Ron Clutho and Amy Lutz for all their efforts on the program, for getting the word out. I want to give an extra shout out to Ron because he put so much hard work into putting together that timeline and overview of Hungary that hopefully you received in the email this afternoon. If you registered after 2 p.m., hopefully you got that message. If for some reason you didn't get it, don't worry. I'm going to post a link for that handout in the chat during the program, so you'll still be able to get it. It's definitely worth a look. It's really beautiful. And it's a great introduction to Hungary. And on the very last page of that handout, you'll find a list of some films and books that are useful for additional learning if you want to go back and do a little more learning about Hungary and this period of history. So at this time, I'm going to turn the screen over to Amy Lutz with the Holocaust Museum, who's going to share a little bit about their work with you before we get started. So Amy, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Emily. I am very excited to be here tonight for this exciting program. I am honored to serve as the manager of communications and social media at the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. As some of you may know, we've been around for over 25 years in the St. Louis area. Hopefully you had an opportunity to visit us in Creve Coeur on Lindbergh. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to visit us, we are actually currently closed for renovations in anticipation of an exciting reopening and expansion next year, which I'll discuss here in a couple seconds. So during the 25 years of the museum's history, we've reached about 30,000 people a year. So that's about 20,000 students actually from the St. Louis region, from Missouri and Illinois, but also from the rest of the country, and actually from several countries around the world. We've done teacher training, law enforcement training, programs for students, virtual programs, in-person programs. We have our ongoing film series. Our next program in our film series is actually this coming Sunday. And we've been very lucky, like many other organizations and many other museums, that we've been able to move our programs virtually, first during COVID, but now during the time when we are preparing for our expansion. So I encourage you to keep an eye on some of the upcoming programs we have from the museum. As I mentioned, we will be reopening with a really exciting renovation and expansion in summer 2022. We will be quadrupling the size of the museum facility. We will have new state-of-the-art technology, a larger museum space, state-of-the-art archives, and a space called the Impact Lab, where visitors will be able to consider current contemporary events through the lens of the Holocaust. So we are very excited for our reopening next year. And as we're waiting for that exciting reopening, as I mentioned, I encourage you to visit our website at stlholocaustmuseum.org or visit us on social media, and you will be able to get all the updates about some of our upcoming exciting programs. So hopefully you'll have an opportunity to become engaged with us at some point in the future. I want to be brief, so I'm actually going to turn over the program right now to Ron Clutho with Bilingual International Assistance Services.
Let's see, I think. Okay, there we are. Thank you, Amy. I'm with Bilingual International Assistance Services. We're a social service and mental health agency that was actually founded by a refugee. We serve immigrants and refugees, and in particular, survivors of torture and war trauma. So as such, we've been, as Emily mentioned, we've been commemorating the UN Day in support of victims of torture for about 10 years with our collaborative partners, the Holocaust Museum and the History Museum. And we focus on a different event or country every year, and it's usually tied to an anniversary. So I think some of you may have heard for example, our presenter a couple of years ago, who spoke about her experiences surviving the genocide in Rwanda. That was the 25th anniversary of the genocide there. It was a very moving testimony. This year is the 65th anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution. So we are honoring the brave Hungarian students and workers and ordinary citizens that stood up to tyranny in 1956. I thought I was familiar with the Hungarian Revolution, but I did not realize the extent to which physical torture was actually carried out both during and before the revolution. Our presenter tonight is Professor Barna Szabo, who was a university student in the Western Hungarian city of Sopron in 1956 when the revolution started. He's going to share with us some of his thoughts and experiences and memories. Professor Szabo, like thousands of other Hungarians, left Hungary after the revolution and was living in Austria when he and some of his classmates from Sopron were offered a scholarship to finish their studies at the University of Toronto. So although he says he didn't speak English, he did go, and he did well enough to complete that degree and go on to complete a master's and a PhD in civil engineering at the State University of New York in Buffalo, where he graduated in 1968. He was then offered a position to teach at Washington University, which he accepted. And until he retired in 2014, he served as the Albert P. and Blanche Y. Greensfelder Professor of Mechanics. I hope I got that right. Professor Szabo is a member of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and the St. Louis Academy of Sciences. He's written 3 books. He's written dozens of articles about engineering and mechanics and things which I have no understanding of. But he's also passionate about his country, and that I can understand. Professor Szabo is going to speak for about 40 minutes. If any questions come to mind as he's speaking, feel free to type them into the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as time allows. As Emily said, you should have gotten an attachment with your email with the link to this event with some suggested further reading and some historical timelines that might be interesting for you. I think after hearing this presentation, a lot of us might want to learn more about Hungary. And I was given Professor Szabo's name by somebody who told me he would be a good speaker for our event. he had no idea who I was, but I called him and he graciously immediately agreed to be our keynote speaker. So we really appreciate his time and effort. I know he's put a lot of work and passion into this presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Barna Sabo, and we'll be very enlightened with his talk tonight.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you very much for the very kind and fine introduction, Ron. And it is my pleasure to join you tonight, and thank you all of those who tuned in to listen to this presentation for their time. I would like to say, or begin with, by saying a few words about the country I was born in, Hungary. Let me say this, that Hungary is a small country. Of exactly how small is visible in the superimposed map on Missouri. It's about half size, a little more than half size of Missouri. If we align the southern border of Hungary with the southern border of Missouri, then the northern part goes roughly to the Highway 70. And in the east-west direction, Hungary pretty well spans the state of Missouri. So this is just an idea of the size of this country. By way of population, Missouri is about 6 million. Hungary is just under 10 million. I'd like to mention also that Hungary, like most other European countries, are having a very low fertility rate. So right now the population is 10 million, but the United Nations predicts that by the year 2050, it will be only 7 million. And that is typical of countries in Hungary, not just in all of Europe. Hungary, as you see on the map here, has 7 neighbors. These are Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Romania, Ukraine, Slovakia, and Austria. Out of these 7 neighbors, 5 speak a Slavic language. Romanians speak a Romance language, and Austrians, of course, speak German. Hungarian language is very different from any one of those. It's a Uralic language that is very expressive, and it's a very suitable language for the expression of emotions. Let me underline this statement by an authority in the subject of George Bernard Shaw, a Nobel laureate in literature in 1925. He writes, after studying the Hungarian language for years, I can confidently conclude that had Hungarian been my mother tongue, my life work would have been more precious, simply because through this extraordinary, ancient, and powerful language, it is possible to precisely describe the tiniest differences and the most secretive tremors of emotions. Well, it's a beautiful statement. I just like to add my own experience with the English and the Hungarian language is that I found it much easier to write love letters in Hungarian than in English, and I found it much easier to write business letter in English than in Hungarian. In order to understand the troubled history in this past century of Hungary, we need to look at this map. This map shows the Hungary as it was during the Austro-Hungarian times, which lasted until June 4, 1920. At June 4, 1920, peace terms were imposed on Hungary, by which it lost roughly 2/3 of its territory, the northern part to Czechoslovakia, the eastern part to Romania, the southern part to Croatia and Serbia, and the western part to Austria. So Hungary was trimmed down. I'm showing this map to you because the terms of the peace treaty were a huge shock to Hungarian society. They just simply had difficulty understanding why this happened, how it happened, and why they were punished in this severe way. So even today, there's a lot of resentment about these peace terms imposed in 1920. And when I was growing up, I remember this poster which says, "No, no, never," meaning that we never will accept the terms of this peace treaty. Now, mentioning this to you is because the Hungary was motivated by the expectation that these lost territories would be returned to her, and therefore joined the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, which was had a disastrous consequences. The Hungarian Second Army was virtually annihilated in the Battle of Stalingrad and suffered 84% casualties. So it was a horrible loss of blood that early in the war, and that continued on. So to give you a few summary of events, I will begin with March 19, 1944, when Hungary fell under German control. The operation was called Operation Margaret, and the deportation of Hungarian Jews, which was overseen by SS Colonel Adolf Eichmann, began on that after that day. I actually have memory of that day. It was Sunday. My father was recovering from surgery in a military hospital in Budapest, and my mother and I traveled by train to Budapest to visit him. As the taxi took us from the railway station to the hospital, my mother remarked that an unusually large number of armed German soldiers were on the streets. I sensed from her very tone that something was wrong. Children usually pick up the emotions much easier than the facts or the understanding of what was going on. Well, what was wrong was that on that day, 8 German divisions carried out Operation Margaret and occupied Hungary to prevent Hungary from making a separate peace with the Soviet Union. At this point, in March 9, the advancing front line was already in southwestern Ukraine, roughly at the river Bug at that time. Then in October 15, which was another Sunday, Hungary declares armistice with the Soviet Union, but this is while Hungary is under German occupation. This was a very difficult thing to pull off. In fact, when the declaration occurred at noon, I remember the radio announcement occurred at around lunchtime. He was taken into custody immediately. And in the following day, an Aerocross party, the Nazi party, takes power. So they were in power from October 16 till 1944 until April 4, 1945. But at that date, the Red Army occupied all of Hungary. So the Aerocross party controlled decreasing part of Hungary over the time. In the October 15, the Russians were already at the river Tisa, and the Battle of Debrecen was on. So therefore, the fighting occurred already on Hungarian territory. The headquarters of the Aerocross party was a building on Rási út 60. It's now known as the House of Terror. It's a beautiful building on a major avenue, and the Aerocross party set it up as a headquarters, and it also performed torture and all kinds of atrocities against people who resisted them or who were not actually, they considered everybody who was not on their side to be resistors. So hundreds of people were tortured in this building. And after the Soviet occupation, it became a state security agency. Let me just add that the head of the Aerocross party called this building the house of loyalty. This was an Orwellian term long before Orwell wrote his book. Let me just briefly mention the case of Andrzej Barczyk-Żulinski. He was an influential Hungarian politician and an important voice in the struggle against German expansion and military policy. On March 19, on the date I mentioned to you when Operation Margaret was carried out, he was arrested by the Gestapo. He resisted arrest and was wounded in the process. But on October 11, he was freed at the request of the Hungarian government. It was still functioning under the German occupation until October 15. Then after October 15, the fascist government of Szálasi arrested him, tortured him, and executed him by hanging on Christmas Eve on December 24, 1944 in Sopron-Kőhida. And he's honored by important streets being named after him in Budapest and just about every other town in Hungary. I have a picture here of the prison of Sopron-Kőhida where he was executed. There are many other people who were executed too, and I cannot mention all of it. And on the right, you see a heartrending picture of shoes on the memorial walk in Budapest, close to the Parliament building. In these waning days of the war, when Hungary was already being approached by the Soviet army, the militiamen of the Aerocross party rounded up hiding Jewish citizens. And the stories of Anne Frank played out over and over again. And these people were lined up by the Danube and shot, so their bodies fell into the cold waters of the Danube. And to commemorate that, you see these shoes on the memorial walk in Budapest. You see the chain bridge in the distance. The State Protection Agency was the secret police of the Hungarian People's Republic from 1949. It was conceived as an appendage of the Soviet Union secret police force, and it gained a reputation for brutality. If you enter that, it's the museum now, you will see the photographs and other documentation of the people who went through there. In March 5, 1945, another Missouri, an event important in Missouri and the world, it occurred in Fulton, Missouri, when Churchill delivered what's known as the Iron Curtain speech. The Iron Curtain speech states, let me just quote exactly. It has the sentence in it, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. So Churchill understood the new political realities of Europe about the formation of the Iron Curtain on March 5 already. And it's an interesting story why the speech took place in Fulton, Missouri. But those of you who don't know that, there is a wonderful museum there on the campus of Westminster College, and it's very much worth visiting, where the story of the Iron Curtain speech is told. On November 4, nevertheless, in November 4, Hungary had the free elections where 17% voted for the Communist Party, 57% voted for a center-right party, and however, under Soviet pressure, key cabinet posts went to the communists. I have to mention here that the time the hyperinflation occurred in Hungary, the post-World War hyperinflation in Hungary is the record for most extreme monthly inflation rate ever. Prices doubled every 15.3 hours in the mid-1946. So here you see displayed 100 tenge. Tenge was the foreign, the currency up until that 1946. And in the 1930, if somebody earned 200 tenges, two of those bills a month, he was comfortably middle class, had a comfortable middle class existence. in April of 1946, you see 100,000 million tenge, which is an enormous number. And that probably could buy you a movie ticket or something like that. So it was an incredible inflation. Why was this occurring? Well, the Soviet occupation, during the Soviet occupation, the communists who came in with the occupying force got hold of the printing presses and they just kept printing away. And with this, they essentially destroyed the middle class. Anybody who had any kind of a saving, it completely evaporated. So finally, when the tenge was changed to the current currency forint in 1946, the exchange rate, one forint was 1 to the 29th power tenge. That means that 1 and 29 zeros after that. So can you imagine that? Dates and events. August 18, 1949, the communists take power. Hungary becomes a people's republic. It would be too complicated to explain how they did it, but it was by deception in many ways, backed by the Soviet occupying forces, accusations of treason, all kinds of things that we cannot go into it today, but nevertheless, communists gained power and they then declared Hungary to be a people's republic. I will mention an execution of a faithful communist, László Rajk. He was executed by hanging in October 1549. And the story is an amazing because it reflects the kind of moral decay and corruption that existed inside the Soviet Union and in the halls of power during those times. March 14, the turn of events, Stalin dies. March 4th, 1953, Stalin dies. And the big event that I'll be covering here is February 24, 1956, when Khrushchev delivers the secret speech to the 20th Party Congress in Moscow, in which he essentially tried to Stalinize the Soviet Communist Party. Then on October 6th, leading up to the revolution of 1956, former convict László Rajk is reburied with honors. There were very large crowds at that time, and the feeling of change was palpable. There was a strange statement made by someone who knew Rajk. Rajk was a hardline communist. He was tricked into confess against himself. And he made the following statement at the funeral, sensing the change in the air. If the poor guy were alive, he would surely have us shot now. So therefore, this is the kind of dark humor that came out of that. I have to speak about the network of informants, which made life in communist Hungary terrible. This was fear. This makes the crowd celebrate the leaders, makes the artists willing to erect a statue to the tyrant. So the question is, who were the informants? Well, the informants were family members, friends, neighbors, respected lawyers, and doctors. Informants were blackmailed and threatened by torture. I'd like to give you a specific example. A friend of our family, a popular and respected lawyer, he was a jolly good fellow, one who liked wine, women, and so on. One day, he was told to report to the local office of the State Security Agency. He was made to wait for hours before he was shown into the office of the chief, opened a thick dossier, and immediately got to the point. I wanted to see you because it came to my attention that you made derogatory statements about the party, the government, and the People's Republic. He mentioned a couple of specific dates and places where those offenses occurred. He continued, the usual punishment for these offenses is internment in a forced labor camp. However, I'm willing to forget this time if you agree to report to us whenever you witness similar disloyal behavior. It seemed to him that it was easy way out was to agree to report. He was given papers to sign, a cover name, and a contact inside the agency. He was to report in 2 weeks intervals or sooner if reportable events occurred. Of course, he resolved not to report anything. So even 2 weeks, so every 2 weeks, he turned in a report saying that there was nothing to report. Then he was called in again. He was told that it came to their attention that statements were made in his presence that he should have reported but did not. Therefore, the deal was off. He was thrown into a cell, stripped and beaten on the sole of his feet. Then he was made to stand for hours. Sleep was denied to him. After 3 days of that, he was told that he can go now, but should he fail to report again, the next time it will be worse, much worse. That is how a network of informants was created. The tentacles of tyranny were everywhere. Now, after this gruesome story, I have to tell you a lighter story. In June 28, 1948, Yugoslavia was expelled from the Cominform. The Cominform is the Communist Information Bureau. This was the gold standard of communist political correctness. In June 1948, Yugoslavia was expelled and its leader, Joseph Tito, suddenly became a bad guy. Actually, worse than that, he was called names like the chain dog of American imperialists. You see Tito here. So this was a deportable offense according to those rules, but a story went around like this. 2 Hungarians are thrown into a dark, damp jail cell. One asked the other, "Why are you here?" "Because I forgot to decorate my house on the anniversary of the Great Bolshevik Revolution." "And why are you here?" "Because I decorated my house for that anniversary." "So how is it possible that you are here also?" "Well, I put up the portraits of Rákosi, Stalin, and Tito. They knocked on my door and asked me, 'Why did you put up the portrait of that criminal evildoer?' And I asked, 'Which one?'" So that was the story that people somehow had a little bit of relief from the tension and pressure that was going on. In order to understand Reich's story, I have to say a few words about Arthur Koestler. He's the author of Darkness at Noon, German. It appeared in German in 1941. Orwell's 1984 was actually published 8 years later. So this dystopian world view was already in the writings at that time. Koestler has an interesting life. He started off as a communist and then became an anti-communist. In between, he spent a month on death row during the Spanish Civil War under Franco's custody, and later was exchanged for other prisoners. So he was able to go to England, where he lived until he died. He wrote the book Darkness at Noon. And just very briefly, the story outline is that Nicholas Rubashov, an old Bolshevik, is arrested in the middle of the night for a reported plot to assassinate a political leader. Now, there's nothing that he did like that. At the interrogation, Rubashov is surprised that his interrogator is a friend named Ivanov, with whom he served during the Civil War. They have an almost pleasant conversation before Ivanov asks Rubashov to confess. Weeks go by. Rubashov is holding out. Ivanov himself is arrested and executed. Then comes Gletkin, a hardliner who takes over the investigation. Rubashov is forced to stay awake for days at a time and is given a very little food. Eventually, Rubashov confesses knowing that he will be sentenced to death. The reason I gave you this storyline, because that is exactly how it was in the case of Laszlo Rak I mentioned earlier. In 1936, he was a commissar of the International Brigade in the Spanish Civil War. From 1941, he was a leading figure in the underground communist movement. In December 1944, he was arrested and was to be executed. However, his elder brother, Endre, who was a fascist, interesting family, undersecretary, interviewed. From 1945, leading figure in the Hungarian Communist Party. He appointed Minister of the Interior, later Minister of the Foreign Affairs. So in America, if you hear Minister of Interior, you understand it's somebody who takes care of the national parks. Well, in Communist Hungary, the Minister of Interior is looking after the police. So actually, he was instrumental in setting up the State Security Agency while he was Minister of the Interior, that eventually caused his death, his torture and death. In 1949, he's arrested in charges of spying and with Tito's sympathies, confessed in a public trial and was executed by hanging. In 1955, he was rehabilitated and reburied with honors in 1956 in October. Let me just say another prisoner who went through András Shiút 60, and that is Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty. He personifies an uncompromising opposition to both fascism and communism in Hungary. He was Bishop of Veszprém during the 1944. He was arrested by the Szálasi government and kept in the Sopron-Kőhida prison that I mentioned earlier. Later on, he was appointed Primate of Hungary and Archbishop of Esztergom, then arrested and accused of treason, conspiracy, and other offenses in December of 48. Following a short trial, he was sentenced to life imprisonment in February 1949. He was freed in the 1956 revolution and was under the asylum of the US Embassy between 1956 and 71. This is cover of the time in November 14, 1948. Let me just say about his own words about his torture. He said, writes in his memoirs, about the inner life of 60 András Shiút and whatever happened there, anyone who has neither been a prisoner nor an interrogator cannot have a slightest idea. First, I had to pull off my cassock. They laughed mockingly at my underwear. I was put into a loose Oriental style, multicolored, striped clown suit. My cell was 4 by 5 meter dark room. It was low with no ventilation, even though there were 5 of us in there. A tall, chunky, bull-necked guard kicked me in the back and held me down and started beating me with a rubber truncheon. He started on my feet and kept going up, I moaned in my pain. I was dragged into the interrogation. I had not slept in 48 hours, which is a torment. I had to endure humiliatingly filthy conversation while tobacco smoke was blown at me. During the night interrogations, the interrogators themselves became tired. They were alternating more and more often. I started to see dancing circles on the wall and in the air, had a recurrence of my Bezadov's disease. As my resistance declined, apathy, paralysis, and indifference set in. Nothing mattered. True and false became almost identical. In my tired, paralyzed state, I began to believe that maybe I'm guilty after all. My inner resistance was getting weaker, my nervous system twitching at the thought of a rubber truncheon. That is why I signed the text, meaning the confession, but next to my name, I wrote the letter CF, Latin coactus feci, meaning that I signed it under duress. The story was dramatized in a British film that won many awards, and the Cardinal's role is played by Alec Guinness, the interrogator's role by Jack Hawkins, and it won, as I mentioned, many awards. And those of you who might be interested in the storyline of the prisoner, it was the 1955 before really it was known exactly what happened to him, differs. And as the poster on the right shows, it's a psychological drama where the interrogator is playing with the nervous system of the prisoner. After he has left Hungary, was allowed to leave Hungary, the cardinal came to St. Louis. Here we see him at the Hungarian church on 3rd Street. And the Hungarian ladies of St. Louis turned out in their fineries. You can see them sitting in the front row. And on the left is my dear wife, Magdalene. So you see, and the other ladies too. Then the cardinal gave a mass in St. Louis Cathedral as well. On the left is Cardinal Carberry, and of course, in the center is Cardinal Mindszenty. Now, let me just, since we're running late, say a few words about Sopron. Ron mentioned that that's where I was a university student in 1956 when the revolution occurred. This town is just a few miles from the Austrian borders inside Hungary. And this is the center of the town with showing the city hall and the hotel. In order to understand what the revolution was and how this came about, you have to understand something of how the role intellectuals played in the process of people coming to actually fighting on the street. So writers and artists in the People's Republic of Hungary essentially had two choices, either to stop working or produce a politically correct works, nothing else. Now, I cannot show you the writings because that's not suitable for visual presentation, but they were producing essentially propaganda art, telling the story of the labor movement and the class struggle, which is what the rulers wanted them to say. That doesn't mean that the art they produced wasn't very good. Actually, it is. And these pictures were taken in the Memorial Park in Budapest, where all of these statues, socialist realism, done in the under those rules and times, they were collected and put up so that people can see it's an open air park, open air museum. So how did it happen? Well, at the first opportunity when the communist dictatorship exposed in weakness, and I mentioned to you about the rehabilitation and reburial of Laszlo Rajk, that occurred on October 6, 1956. This meant that writers and journalists were eager to come clean because they noticed the weakness in the party and started to write boldly about the weaknesses and past grievances. So this was previously unthinkable. People then understood that through those writings, that change was possible. This led to the formulation of demands by university students. I was one of them, and we were even not in Budapest, we had our meetings, we had our formulated our own demands pretty well along the same lines as students at other universities. And in Budapest, there was a demonstration, a peaceful demonstration, was joined by the general public. And the idea was that the demands formulated by the university students should be broadcast in the Hungarian radio on October 23rd in the evening, in the late afternoon, early evening hours. The building, being strategic importance for the regime, was guarded by the state security members of the state security agency, and they of course refused to read the demands into the radio. And so the government, the communist government at that time, sent an armored unit stationed in Budapest to the radio building to disperse the crowd. Instead, that unit joined the demonstrators and the revolution was on. The commander of that armored unit was Colonel Pál Maléter. We'll mention his name again later on. Now, this is what the Hungarian radio looked like when the fighting was over and the revolution was in full swing. Now, what were those demands that triggered the revolution or that led to the events that culminated in fighting? Well, the first demand was, which every university group who formulated demands agreed on, we demand the immediate withdrawal of the Soviet troops. Second demand, the new government must be constituted under the leadership of Imre Nagy. All criminal leaders of the Stalin-Rákosi era must be dismissed immediately. Imre Nagy was a reform communist. You have to understand that after Stalin died in 1953, there was a thaw in the Soviet Union and a corresponding thaw in the satellite countries as well. Imre Nagy then used that thaw to introduce, was appointed prime minister and introduced very popular reform that eased various restrictions that allowed, for example, for me to study at a university that would have been impossible without him. Then the next statement, next demand was general elections by universal secret ballot to select the new National Assembly with the participation of all political parties. Well, of course, up to that point, there's only one political party. We demanded the right of workers to strike be recognized. It's interesting that in a socialist country, that was not a right. We demand a complete reorganization of Hungary's economic life under the direction of experts. The reason is because political hacks were running the country and they were making big mistakes that caused economic loss. We demand that the statue of Stalin, symbol of Stalinist tyranny and political oppression, be removed as soon as possible. We demand the replacement of the emblems foreign to the Hungarian people by the old Hungarian coat of arms. So this was the emblem foreign to the Hungarian people, and the demand was to replace it with the traditional one. And since there was no time to produce flags in 1956, so people just cut a hole in the flags, and the revolutionary flag is the red, white, and green flag of Hungary with a hole in the middle. So before the Hungarian Revolution, we had a statue of Stalin. You see the size of it. And then after the revolution in 1956, in October 23, yet it was destroyed, and you see it on the ground. Let me close by a poem that was written in 1950 at the height of the tyranny by Gyula Ilyes. He writes a sentence about tyranny. This is really one sentence. The whole poem is one sentence. And he starts with this. I cannot read the whole thing, of course, but it was translated to English. So where tyranny exists, that tyranny exists not only in the barrel of the gun, not only in the cells of a prison, not just in the interrogation block or the small hours of the clock, the guards bark and his fist. The tyranny exists not just in the billowing black feeder of the closing speech of the prosecutor in the justified use and force, a prisoner's dull moors. So it's a simple sentence, 184 line, and it is about how tyranny conquers everything in human relationships, in private and public life. Not only does armed power rule with the harshest of methods, but it also steals itself into one's private life, poisoning family, work, and love. Then eventually carries tyranny to his grave. The poem ends with, because where tyranny obtains, everything is in vain. The song itself, though fine, is false in every line. For he stands over you at your grave and tells you who you were. Your every molecule he is to dispose and rule. So finally, a word about the retribution. Well, following the failed revolution and the communist hardliners regaining power, although this bunch of communists who were set into the government by the occupying Soviets, tried to distance themselves from the previous Stalinist group. They were really no different. They executed a very large number of citizens of Hungary, among them Ilona Toth, a 25-year-old medical student who was falsely accused of injecting a wounded Soviet soldier by poison. Later, I mentioned a colonel who came to the radio building when the revolution was just about to start. He was executed by hanging in June 16, 1958. And Imre Nagy, the Prime Minister of Hungary, was appointed by the Constitution of Hungary as it existed then. So he was a legal prime minister in every sense of the word. He too was executed on that day, and his grave is now honored by everybody. So these people who were hanged, they were buried in a large public cemetery in a remote area in an unmarked grave face down. And so when the political change is allowed, the exhumation of his remains, the family was asked, where would you like to put his gravesite? And the family said, we would like it to the same place that you found. Thank you. That ends my presentation anyway, so it's back to you.
All right. Give you a second to unscreen share. Thank you, Professor Sabo, for that very incredible presentation. I particularly am very interested in kind of your personal reflections. Just as a reminder to the audience, we do have the Q&A function. We're going to move into a time of question and answer. So please ask your questions in the little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But as we're waiting for more questions to come in, we actually already have a few. So let me start with this one. This is kind of a two-part question. Did the communist regime close churches, and were people allowed to attend church?
People were allowed to attend church, but notes were taken of people who attended church. So for example, if you were a teacher and you were found to have attended church, you were called in and essentially warned that this practice must stop. So any public figure could not go to church, but actually the churches were much more full at the time of the communist era than they are now.
It's very interesting. There's a whole discussion, I think, to be had about why that is.
Right.
You know, I'm curious, as someone coming from the Holocaust Museum, I really appreciated your talk about your personal memory of March 19th, 1944. And I'm curious, I'm trying to figure out the best way to phrase this question. I know you were very young during the time of 1944, but being someone who lived under both Nazi and Soviet occupation, do you feel like there were differences or similarities between both? Did you sense some familiarities when the Soviets took power the year following the Nazis, or anything? What was that like to experience both situations?
Well, there's a lot of commonality between the fascist and the communist ways of ruling. They both have one-party systems, or that's what they best, and they are both will use torture if you resist them. They will kill you if you resist them. And from that point of view, there's very little difference. Maybe the ideology is different, but the methods are actually exactly the same. Whereas the fascist or the Nazis, they were looking at your birth certificate and wanted to see if you have Jewish background or something like that. The communists were looking at another entry in your resume, and they wanted to know what kind of family you came from. Their idea was that once you're in the middle or upper class, you cannot be a faithful communist, and therefore you were a potential or actual class enemy. So therefore, depending which item in your resume would be picked out, that's the way you were treated by the regime. In both cases, however, the regime turned on its citizens.
Wow. I'm glad you mentioned that, because actually the next question is very similar to something you just mentioned.
Yes.
So you talked about the extreme hyperinflation during the post-war
Yes.
period in Hungary. You know, the Weimar Republic also experienced quite significant hyperinflation,
Yes,
and the
exactly.
Nazis, you know, talked about the Jews and, you know, blaming, you know, scapegoating certain groups. Was it similar in the Soviet Union? Did they blame the wealthy or the elite? What was that like?
No, I think the Soviet Union, the ruble was maintaining its power because it was artificially maintained. The reason why they printed money in Hungary is because they actually were able to do that, given the circumstances, and they willfully wanted to destroy the middle class. Anybody who had savings became paupers unless you hid gold, but hiding gold was also illegal at the time, you know, so it was a terrible way of kind of existing. And when I read that poem about tyranny, people had this existential threat day in, day out. They didn't know who might report them for something, or somebody might even, for example, in our family, during the Stalinist era, it was routine that, not routine, but several times it happened that the police would knock on the door and they produced a document saying that we have to search your house for whatever contraband that you might have. Now, if they would themselves hide a gun or something illegal there and they find it, they could do anything to us. And then they would publicize that we see this family was resisting, etc., and wasn't. What they did to the kulaks is something else again. It was a horrible treatment. And why? Because they were successful people who cultivated lands, and they employed maybe other people, and they were the ones who produced. And because of this crazy idea of a class struggle, they had to eliminate them. It was a complete nonsense, but see, they were in power. They could do anything they wanted.
I'm sure it was a very frightening time to live under that regime and similar regimes.
Yes.
Switching gears just a little bit here, the next question, were there any popular revolts or uprisings before 1956?
Yes, Berlin uprising in 1953, which was smaller, and preceding the Hungarian uprising was the Poznan uprising in June of 1956, where Polish workers were revolting and they were put down. In fact, when I was a university student and we organized our march in the city of Sopron, there was a Polish hero who was honored by Hungarians, and there was a memorial relief in his honor. And our slogan was that we are in solidarity with the Polish workers who were revolting in Poznan and were put down. So in other words, that was another reference point for us to use in this on those days.
Wow, wow. So this next question is a little longer. It's kind of two-part, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this. Hungarian, as you can probably
Go
tell,
ahead.
my language. Was the statue of Imre on the bridge destroyed or moved? What is your take on that? Was Orban sending a message? And if so, what was that message?
That I don't understand. I really didn't understand why the statue was moved. There was a statue of Imre Nagy close to the Parliament building, who is standing on a bridge and looking toward the west. So the bridge is symbolizing that he was a figure who would have bridged the chasm between Soviet rules and the Western democracies. And that was his aim, essentially, to make that bridge. It cost his life, of course, as we know. But why that bridge was moved, I have no idea. I don't understand. I do not like it that it was moved, but maybe there's a good reason for it.
Oh, certainly very symbolic, it sounds like.
Yes, it was a good place, actually.
So the next question, a couple part question. What is your take on current Hungary? How did a country go through this revolution and seem to forget the lessons? Modern Hungary seems to embrace older ideas that were the cause of the revolution.
Would you repeat that question again?
What is your take on current Hungary? How did a country go through this revolution you spoke of and seem to forget the lessons? Modern Hungary seems to embrace older ideas that were the cause of the revolution.
Oh, that is one point of view. It's not completely clear that that is a fair description of what it's a center-right government for sure. And it has its own ideas about what its role and place in Europe should be, and it doesn't agree with the prevailing thoughts, but to paint it as an extremist or something that people would revolt against is not. Unfortunately, in Hungary is essentially very similar to the division of opinions between the supporters of Orbán and the supporters of Trump in this country and the opposing side. So it is practically, they do not talk to each other, they talk past each other. And so we'll find out on the next year's elections when the entire opposition formed a coalition to whether or not they can move Orbán from his post.
We'll have to see. So we have time for probably one or two more questions. The next one is kind of a big one, actually, but considering your whole presentation, your experiences, everything that you've talked about, if the audience listening today could take one thing from it, one lesson, one piece of history, what would you like that to be?
Yes, I think that the most important part is the respect of the basic human values are just so important. And I want to underline that, of course, the role of the intellectuals, the importance of the independent press, of maintaining a fair representation of both points of view is unfortunately is not there anymore. It's much the same way as it was at that time. At that time it was forced, now it is more for ideological reasons. But the idea that the press should retain its independence and fairness is essential for the functioning of the democracy. And that's a worrisome situation in Europe as well as in Hungary and this country as well.
Absolutely. It's a great point. So I think we are wrapping up our Q&A session. Actually, I just saw one come in. So this will be the last question here. How is the story of Hungary's history told today in Hungary?
It's a very good question. I think it's more or less what I summarized here. Those were exactly my ideas. I'm not a historian, but I do, as the president of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, when I was elected a member, he was a historian, and I heard him speak, and he said, what I would really like is a history written for that region that all historians of all countries would agree to. And of course, it's a beautiful dream, but it will never happen. Each generation is going to write its own history, and you have to filter it through your own intelligence and experience and wisdom to make sure you retain what is important and let go of what is propaganda.
Absolutely. I apologize. One more question. This is a good one to answer on, actually.
Yes.
or end on. Do you have a fond memory of your fondest memory of your time in Hungary when you were younger?
Yes, my fondest memory was probably before the Russians came into Hungary. I had a very happy childhood. We had a very nice life in Hungary that was, of course, came to an end with the war, and then after that, our family was singled out for being class aliens or class enemies, whatever you want to do, and we were treated really harshly during the Stalinist era.
Wow. Well, I think we will end there. Thank you for your presentation, for answering those questions, and I will turn it back over to Emily.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Barna, for sharing that story. Thank you, Amy, for taking us through the Q&A. And thank you, Ron. Thank you to our collaborator organizations, Bilingual International Assistance Services, and the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. And thank you for tuning in today. I really appreciate you being here to hear this story. I'm going to very quickly share my screen one last time so I can share a couple of upcoming programs with you that you might be interested in checking out. And of course, you can get information about those at our website, mohistory.org, on our Facebook page for Missouri History Museum. Don't forget, you can go back and view this program again and share it with other people, friends and family, on the Missouri Historical Society YouTube channel. And we've got the link in the chat, so make sure to grab that for the handout that we put together for you with a sort of outline and timeline of Hungarian history, some additional resources. If you didn't grab that, if you get out of the program tonight and you say, darn it, I forgot to get that, you can still get that at mohistory.org. If you go to the event listing, you can download that there as well.
Okay.
And finally, of course, don't forget, there should be a very brief little survey that pops up in your browser. We really want to get your feedback. It really does help guide the content and direction of our programming. So I really appreciate your help with that. Thanks again to everyone. Thanks again, Barna, for your time and energy in telling us this story. And hope we see you all again very soon. Take care.
Thank you for organizing it, Emily. Thank you.
Thank you.